Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic. I know a lot of you are curious about common English-speaking mistakes.
Definitely a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to help us really, get into the nitty-gritty, we've gathered some really interesting articles and videos.
Awesome.
You might be surprised to find out that some of these mistakes even trip up native speakers.
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time. That's what makes this deep dive so interesting, I think. It's not about reaching perfection. It's more about just understanding the nuances of how English is really spoken.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. It's about being able to communicate effectively.
Exactly.
So let's start by addressing the elephant in the room that fear a lot of English learners have about actually speaking up. There's this article from Real Life English, and it really emphasizes that even though fear can be a major roadblock, the only way to really improve is by actually speaking.
Right. Makes sense. The more you practice, the better you get. That's true for anything, really. Like in the article, they actually quote Michael Jordan, "I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed."
Wow, that's powerful.
It is, right.
Makes you think about mistakes a little differently, not something to be ashamed of.
Yeah, exactly. There's part of the process. And, speaking of the process, the Real Life English article also talks about the frustration of not being able to fully express yourself the way you can in your native language.
Oh, yeah. I remember when I first started learning,
It can be tough.
a new language, and I would get so frustrated, like I just couldn't find the right words, and people wouldn't understand me, and it almost felt like I was trapped.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where I think this idea of reframing your mindset can really come in handy. Sarabi Jain, in her article on LinkedIn, talks about transforming that anxiety into excitement.
Sounds interesting.
It is. It might seem a bit counterintuitive, but it's really just about shifting your perspective.
Okay, so how do we actually go about reframing that anxiety into excitement?
Well, Jane gives this really interesting example from Simon Sinek, who talks about how Olympic athletes view their pre-competition jitters. Instead of saying they're nervous, they'll say, "I'm excited."
That's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that your body is actually just preparing you to perform at your best.
Okay, so how do we apply that to, the everyday English learner?
It's the same idea. When you feel those butterflies in your stomach, instead of thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to mess up," you can try thinking, "Okay, I'm ready to challenge myself and have a great conversation."
I love that. Okay, so we've tackled the fear factor and talked about embracing those mistakes. Now let's get into some concrete tips for building confidence. Jane mentions this concept called the little skittle approach.
Oh yeah, the little stittle approach. I love that one.
Yeah, can you break that down for us a little bit?
Of course. So think of it like this. You wouldn't try to eat a whole bag of Skittles in one go, right? You'd take them one at a time. And that's the idea behind the little Skittle approach to practicing English.
So instead of being overwhelmed with this idea of becoming, perfectly fluent overnight, you focus on smaller, more manageable steps.
Right. It could be as simple as ordering your coffee in English or asking for directions, having a short conversation with a classmate. Each little Skittle interaction just helps you build confidence and fluency little by little.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It really helps to make it seem a lot less intimidating.
Definitely. And don't underestimate the power of positive affirmations either. Jane also talks about how repeating positive statements about your English speaking abilities can actually help reprogram your subconscious mind.
So even if you don't really believe it at first, just keep telling yourself, I am a confident English speaker. I am making progress every day.
Exactly. It might feel a little silly at first, but trust me, it works. Our brains are really powerful, and the more we feed them those positive messages, the more likely they are to believe them.
That's a great point, and I think sometimes we are our own worst critics. We need to be a little bit more encouraging to ourselves. So speaking of critics, what about that fear of judgment from other people? Like a lot of English learners worry about making mistakes in front of, native speakers especially.
Of course, that's completely understandable. But remember what we were talking about earlier? Everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers.
Right. And there's that great YouTube video by Arnell, and he actually points out that he makes mistakes sometimes, and he's like an English whiz.
Exactly. And that's so important to remember. No one is perfect. And in fact, Jane emphasizes that most people care more about what you're saying than about perfect grammar.
It's more about getting your message across, clearly and confidently.
Absolutely. Think about it. If someone is trying to communicate with you in your native language, even if their grammar isn't perfect, you would still appreciate their effort
Right.
and focus on understanding what they're trying to say, right?
That's a great point.
It's about connection and understanding.
I think we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect, when in reality, communication is about connecting with someone else.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to shift our focus from perfection to progress. Every conversation, every interaction is an opportunity to learn and grow.
All this talk about confidence and embracing mistakes reminds me of another point Jane makes in her article. She says that recording yourself speaking English can be a really helpful tool for improvement. Have you ever read that?
Oh, absolutely. It's one of my favorite techniques, actually. It can feel a little awkward at first,
Yeah.
but it's so valuable for identifying areas where you can improve.
So what should you be listening for when you play back that recording?
Everything. Your pronunciation, your grammar, your vocabulary, your pacing, even your body language if you're recording a video.
So it's like having your own personal English coach.
Exactly. And the best part is you can listen to the recording as many times as you need to, and you can really focus on the specific areas that you want to improve.
That's a great tip. I'm definitely going to try that myself.
I highly recommend it. And don't forget to celebrate your progress along the way, too. Every time you notice an improvement, no matter how small it is, acknowledge it and give yourself credit for it.
That's such a good point because it's so easy to get caught up in the challenges of learning English, and we forget to appreciate how far we've come.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about focusing on the positive, and acknowledging your own efforts. Another technique that Jane suggests is something she calls mirror talk. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't.
So it's basically practicing your English by talking to yourself in the mirror.
Okay.
It might sound a little strange, but it can actually be really helpful for improving your fluency and confidence.
So like having a conversation with your reflection.
Exactly. It gives you a chance to practice your pronunciation, work on your intonation, and experiment with different vocabulary and grammar structures without feeling self-conscious.
That's actually a really good idea.
It is, and you can do it anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't need any special equipment or a language partner. Just find a mirror and start chatting.
Awesome. So we've talked about the importance of confidence and practice, and we've explored some techniques for overcoming those initial hurdles. But what about those pesky grammar mistakes that we all make?
Yeah, those little grammatical gremlins, they can be tricky, but as we've already discussed, they're part of the process. And even native speakers make them.
Oh, for sure. Remember that example from the Go Natural English video about less versus fewer? Even supermarkets get it wrong sometimes.
All the time.
They'll put up a sign that says 10 items or less, when it should be 10 items or fewer.
Such a classic mistake. And it all boils down to whether you're talking about countable or uncountable nouns. So fewer is for things that you can count, like apples or cars, while less is for things you can't count, like water or sand.
Gotcha. So if you're at the supermarket checkout and you have a basket full of, individual items, you should be in the 10 items or fewer lane. But if you're buying like a big bag of rice, you'd need to be in the regular lane.
Exactly. It's a subtle difference, but it's important to get it right.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that, even small grammar mistakes can happen to anyone. Speaking of common errors, what about the confusion between since and for? I know that one trips up a lot of English learners, and honestly, sometimes they even get them mixed up.
It's a tricky one, but the Go Natural English video breaks it down really well. It's all about whether you're talking about a specific point in time or a duration of time.
Right.
So for example, let's say you started learning English in 2020. You would say, I've been learning English since 2020. Because 2020 is a specific point in time. But if you want to talk about how long you've been studying, you'd say, I've been learning English for 3 years.
Right. Okay.
Because 3 years is a duration of time.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So since is like a starting point, and for is like a length of time.
You got it. It's all about context.
Context. And that brings us to another common mistake that even native speakers make: mixing up fun and funny.
Oh, yeah. This is a subtle one, but it's an important distinction.
Right.
Funny means something that makes you laugh,
Okay.
while fun describes something that's enjoyable.
So you might say, that comedian is so funny.
Right.
But you would say, we had a fun time at the party.
Exactly. It's all about using the right word to convey the meaning you intend.
Right. And speaking of word choice, what about those pesky prepositions like, on, in, at, to, and from? That can sometimes be a little confusing.
Oh, those prepositions, those can be tricky. They are essential, though, for clear communication. Like, for example, saying, I'm interested in learning English is very different from saying, I'm interested at learning English.
That's true. The wrong preposition can completely change the meaning of a sentence. So how do we avoid those preposition pitfalls?
I think it just takes practice and attention to detail. Start by paying attention to how native speakers use prepositions in different contexts. You can also find helpful lists and exercises online that focus specifically on preposition usage.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're unsure which preposition to use, just ask a native speaker or consult a reliable grammar resource.
Right. There's no shame in seeking clarification. It shows that you're actively engaged in learning.
Exactly. Speaking of being actively engaged, let's move on to another common mistake that can make English learners sound a bit hesitant.
You're talking about those filler words, right?
Yes, exactly. The ums, ahs, likes, and you knows that tend to, creep into our speech when we're searching for the right word or just feeling a bit nervous.
I think of them as like verbal crutches that we lean on when we're feeling a bit unsure of ourselves.
For sure. But they can be really distracting.
Absolutely. Excessive use of filler words can make you sound, unprepared or unconfident, maybe even a bit unprofessional.
So how do we break free from those filler words?
Well, it takes conscious effort and practice. Start by becoming aware of your own filler word habits. Like record yourself speaking and listen back to identify your most common culprits.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd all be surprised if we actually listened to ourselves.
Exactly. And then once you've identified your patterns, you can start to consciously replace them with pauses.
So instead of saying, just take a breath.
Exactly. Those brief moments of silence might feel a bit awkward at first, but they actually make you sound more thoughtful and articulate.
Yeah, it's like those pregnant pauses in a good movie.
Exactly.
Creates a little bit of suspense.
It does, and it gives your brain a chance to catch up and to formulate your thoughts more clearly.
Yeah, give yourself a mental timeout.
It's funny. I think sometimes we forget that learning a new language is just like learning any other skill. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes patience. We wouldn't expect to become like a concert pianist overnight, so why do we put so much pressure on ourselves to become fluent English speakers in a short amount of time?
That's a really good point. And I think sometimes we get caught up in comparing ourselves to other people.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, they're learning so much faster than me, but everyone learns at their own pace, right?
Exactly. And that comparison game can be really bad for our confidence. It's important to just focus on your own individual journey and celebrate your own unique achievements.
Absolutely. Speaking of achievements, let's shift gears and talk about pronunciation. I know that's another area where a lot of English learners struggle.
It's a common challenge, and it's totally understandable. English pronunciation can be pretty complex with all its different vowel sounds and consonant clusters and intonation patterns.
Yeah, it's like a whole new world of sounds.
Ah.
So what are some tips for improving our pronunciation?
I think one of the most effective techniques is to just listen attentively to native speakers. Pay attention to how they're shaping their mouth, where they're placing their tongue, and how they're using their breath to produce different sounds.
So it's like becoming a sound detective.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to mimic and experiment. Try repeating words and phrases after native speakers and record yourself to see how your pronunciation compares.
Again with the recording.
It's so useful. And remember, there are a ton of resources available to help you with pronunciation. Like you can find pronunciation guides online, watch YouTube videos, or even use apps that provide feedback on your pronunciation.
That's a good point. There's so many resources available. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of creativity to find the right approach that works for you.
Absolutely. Speaking of creativity, have you ever tried using music to improve your pronunciation?
Well, I love listening to music. How can that help?
Well, music is a fantastic way to train your ear to hear different English sounds and rhythms. So choose songs with, clear lyrics and try to sing along, paying close attention to the pronunciation of each word.
I love that idea.
Yeah, and you can even use music to work on your intonation and your rhythm. So pay attention to the way singers rise and fall their voices and try to mimic those patterns.
It really makes it a lot more fun and engaging.
It does, and it's something that you can do anywhere, anytime, right? You can be singing in the shower, you can sing in the car, even while you're cooking dinner.
Yeah. It's all about making it a part of your daily routine.
Exactly, and when you do that, it becomes much less intimidating and much more enjoyable. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's one topic I still want to touch on, and it's that fear of making mistakes in front of native speakers.
Oh, yeah. It comes up a lot.
It's a very real and understandable fear. But as we've discussed throughout this episode, mistakes are just an inevitable part of the process. And in most cases, native speakers are quite understanding and forgiving.
But what if you're in a situation where you really need to communicate something important and you're worried about, making a mistake that could lead to a misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And I think in those situations, it's always a good idea to be as clear and concise as possible. Avoid using, complex vocabulary or grammar structures that you're not completely comfortable with.
Let's keep it simple.
Exactly. And if you're not sure if the other person understands you, don't be afraid to ask for clarification.
Right.
You could say something like, "Did I explain that clearly?" Or, "Do you understand what I mean?"
Right. Good tips. It highlights that importance of like being an active communicator, even when you're feeling nervous.
Exactly. It's all about taking ownership of your communication and just making sure that your message is being understood.
I think a lot of English learners, worry about their accent, whether it's going to prevent them from being understood. What do you think about that?
I think having an accent is totally natural. In fact, it's a beautiful reflection of your linguistic background and your personal journey with English. And honestly, most people are really used to hearing different accents and have no trouble understanding them.
That's good to hear because sometimes, we do get so caught up in trying to like sound like a native speaker when in reality, it's our unique accent that makes us interesting and engaging.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of just embracing our individuality, expressing ourselves authentically.
I love that. So it's not about erasing our accent. It's just about using our voice
Yeah.
to connect with other people and share our own unique perspective.
Well said. This conversation has really reminded me of how much I enjoy exploring these nuances of spoken English.
Me too. It's fascinating how even, those small mistakes can have a big impact on how we communicate. And it's really empowering to know that we can all improve our spoken English, with just a little awareness, a little practice, and a little confidence.
It's true. And speaking of surprises, there's this one grammar point that always trips me up dealing with numbers, especially when they're part of a longer phrase.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Numbers can be tricky, especially when you start combining them with like units of measurement or time. Arnell brings this up in his YouTube video. He uses the example of 2.5 years.
Yeah, okay, so I've definitely heard people say 2 years and a half. Is that wrong?
Well, it's not technically incorrect, but it does sound a little awkward to a native speaker's ear. The more natural way to say it is 2.5 years, keeping the number and its fraction together before the unit of measurement.
It's like a little package deal.
Exactly. And this pattern applies to other measurements too. So you'd say 4.5 miles or 1.5 hours. Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So what about those times when we use a or an to represent one, like $100 or an hour?
Good question. In those cases, the word order changes a bit. You'd say an hour and a half or $150, placing the and a half or and 50 after the main unit.
So it's almost like it's tagging along at the end.
Exactly. It's a subtle difference, but it can make your English sound a lot more natural and fluent.
Yeah, it's amazing all the little nuances that there are in spoken English. But amidst all these tips and tricks, sometimes I just feel overwhelmed. Like, where do I even begin to apply all of this?
Right. And that's a great point. And it kind of brings us back to that whole idea of focusing on progress, not perfection. You don't have to tackle every mistake all at once. Just choose one or two areas that you really want to work on and consciously try to apply those tips in your daily conversations.
So just taking small steps.
Exactly. Small, manageable steps, building up your confidence over time.
And remembering that, this journey of learning English is ongoing.
Always. There's always something new to discover. Always room for growth.
You know what? I think that's an important message for all of us to remember, whether we're learning a new language, starting a new hobby, or just trying to improve ourselves in some way. It's about embracing the process and just enjoying the ride, celebrating those little victories along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Speaking of celebrations, let's end this deep dive by acknowledging how far you've come on your own English-speaking journey. Even if you're just starting out, the fact that you're here listening to this deep dive, engaging with these ideas, and actively seeking ways to improve is definitely something to be proud of.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that we're all in this together. And we all have the potential to achieve our language learning goals with, dedication, perseverance, and a positive attitude.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, you don't have to be perfect to be a successful English speaker. Just embrace your individuality, celebrate your progress, and never be afraid to let your personality shine through.
This has been such a great conversation, so insightful. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into common English speaking mistakes.
It's been a pleasure. And to all of you listening, Keep practicing, keep experimenting, and keep embracing the beauty and the challenges of speaking English.
So until next time, happy speaking.